Dear ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome again with the Swiss Institute for International Studies at Zurich University. My name is Martin Meyer. I am the chairman of the Institute. Welcome also in the name of Walter Kielholz, chairman of our Board of Trustees. We are proud to present tonight our special format again, SIAF Talks, our live stream, directly from the Swiss Re Center for Global Dialogue in Rüschlikon, close to Zurich. Thank you indeed for this hospitality, and also to our host, Sergio Ermotti, chairman of Swiss Re, who is at the same time tonight's guest for our discussion. Sadly enough, we had to learn on very short term that our friend Katia Centinetta has become sick. Actually, she is doing not too bad, but of course had decided to stay at home. A wise decision. We wish her good luck and a quick recovery. Therefore, I replace her as her stunt and hope I will live up to this challenge. Sergio Ermotti is certainly one of the most successful and charismatic leaders of today's finance world. After a long and sustainable career in banking, which culminated in his position as the CEO of UBS for almost 10 years, he is now, as I have already mentioned, the chairman of Swiss Re. Sergio combines a great amount of global experiences all over the world with his love and passion for Switzerland. He was born in Lugano in 1960 and is very much committed to his beautiful native country. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is in turmoil. We face indeed a large amount of risk and crisis, from Russia's war on Ukraine to China's menaces against Taiwan, from more than serious problems concerning Europe's energy needs to global challenges with supply chains, not to mention COVID, the global warming, cybercrime, and other quite unwelcome facts and threats. I'm convinced that our discussion here and now will be highly interesting. Sergio Ermotti is at the same time a brilliant analyst of the economy and a man to see and treat the so-called big picture. Dear Sergio, again, thank you very much for being with us and our host at the same time. My first question is a little bit personal. How do you perceive your new job, your new commitment to Swiss Re after a very successful career in banking?
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, it's true that we are hosting, but you invited me first, so thank you for the invitation. I enjoy it very much. I have to say that after so many years in banking, I was definitely looking to do something that would keep many of the aspects that I developed in my career, the skills and the knowledge and the network I had, and while the ability also combining that with the ability to learn something new. So moving from banking to insurance, so within the financial services industry, was I would say a pretty natural step outside banking. In addition to that, the fact that at Swiss Re is a global organization based in Switzerland. My former UBS is also a global organization based in Switzerland with, a lot of people and activities outside Switzerland, brings similarities that are helping a lot, in terms of my transition to a new role. So it's quite exciting. If I look at, banking and insurance at the end of the day are not so different. I mean, of course, if you go down to certain aspects of the business, you recognize differences, but we are also, in insurance and banking, we are managing market risk, liquidity risk, credit risk. We are managing underwriting risk, although from a different standpoint of view, of course, between insurance and lending activities. So this aspect of risk management is there for both, and I enjoy the ability to, also come into a new sector with different views, and at the same time, as I said, learning something new.
But also with a lot of global responsibility, what's going on in the world.
Yeah, fine. It's clear that I take my role very seriously, but the responsibilities are different than the one you have as an executive. Our chief executive officer is the one running the business, who has to be the one on top of all the details and everything that goes on every day. I have the luxury of being a little bit more, if you want to say, the trainer, and to be the challenger.
And maybe also the chief diplomat.
Yes, that one I had to learn over the years. But, I'm reaching good standards by now, yes.
I'm sure. How is it to live a good life, constantly thinking about risk and dealing with risks? Doesn't make that you nervous, or is it a stress, or do you take it on a more philosophical point that life anyway is a risk and the world even more? How do you cope with that?
Well, taking risks is part of life, as you mentioned. No matter if you are a business or individuals, you take risks. Some people, even individuals, they like to take risks. They look for risk-taking activities in sports or in life, in anything they do. So it's part of our, modus operandi. I do enjoy more than just taking risk, managing risks, and I enjoy the most managing risk where the risk reward is appropriate for what we do. And that's the most fundamental part. Also, risks are offering always an opportunity. I mean, without risk taking, you would have, de facto, no innovation, no economic growth, and finally, risks is also giving you an opportunity, like in our case, as an insurer, to help people resolve or mitigate risks,
exactly.
Come up with solutions that help people to mitigate risks. So in that sense, no, I don't see it as a problem. I can live well with risk-taking, as I said, as long as it's a balanced and sustainable risk-taking.
No sleepless nights.
No, that one is not a problem. No.
Okay. Our topic tonight, as you know, is a world full of new risks, and there is a question mark. I think the question mark is a placebo because we have a world with a lot of new risks. Could you mention some which are really worrying you and analyzing you, this kind of new risks we are facing as a challenge for the whole world, politically, economically? What's in your perception the main risks?
No, I mean, I have to say that probably here I will say the obvious, but the risks that are more difficult to assess and to manage are the ones that become more and more interconnected. I mean, the problem nowadays is not necessarily breaking down risks and analyze them and manage them, or avoid them, or whatever. The problem is that no matter what you do, you may have second-order effects coming in and more impacting what you do. So what worries me the most is, obviously, is the risk I don't know, the risk we are not discussing, But in essence, is the fact that in many cases, more and more, the correlation between risk factors increases to one, instead of enjoying diversification. We are used, not only in business but in life, to be able to diversify risks. Nowadays, you find almost any event happening in the world affecting society, economies, and politics at the end of the day, more
Absolutely.
and more. So that's the most challenging part of the equation.
Absolutely. It comes so together, interwoven, and which also makes then quick solutions much more difficult. Now, looking quickly back to the pandemic of COVID, was this exceptional state foreseeable? Could we have insured ourselves, companies, whatever?
Well, what foreseeable for sure, yes, it was, because it's not the first time in humankind that you have a pandemic. So the illusion that we could avoid that, has been there because it's humankind. If you don't see an event or you don't go through an event on a regular basis or with a high degree of frequency, you tend to think that risk doesn't exist, and you play it down.
Right.
For example, I can say in another matter, we have been used to live in such a low interest rates environment that people don't think even remotely that interest rates can go up, up 5, 6, 7%. Right?
That's a very dangerous behavior,
Right.
of course. But
yeah, but it's only because you go through for so many years in a new paradigm. Now, coming back to your question, on the pandemic side, the risk has been flagged, almost since the beginning of the SARS event in 2000. I would say Ebola. And in that sense, my observation are twofold. First of all, it is clear that the ability to contain SARS and Ebola has probably created, in the years to come, in the recent history, an illusion that things can be controlled. And in my point of view, what happened with COVID in the early stage, probably including myself, I have to say, when we heard about COVID, we thought, well, okay, it's another SARS, right? So it's going to be contained, it's Hong Kong or China or whatever, they're going to contain it. So the underestimation of how things can spread out of control. And also, I have to say that many of the preemptive and reactive tools available for governments and society to react to such an event were not fully implemented or were not kept up to speed with reality. And so things spread out so quickly.
Yes.
Now, to your question, of course, so the answer to your first question, yes, we could have predicted. So, but was an underestimation. The answer to the second question, could we insure, or could we have insured a pandemic event like that? The answer is not, because pandemic, if you knew that a pandemic is coming, and if we would have realized as a society, in insurance or in banking, in any kind of business, that a pandemic is likely to come, even certain degree of coverage that we saw coming into the system would have probably not been granted. But for sure today, we know that for the foreseeable future, next 30, 50 years, pandemic risk will be totally excluded.
Yeah.
Why? Because if an event is so widespread and gives you as an insurer no diversification, it's not insurable.
Absolutely. But do you think, nevertheless, that the society and science and also reinsurance companies are probably or hopefully better prepared for a next pandemic in these dimensions?
Well, I hope at least the health and system and the organizational setup of many governments can be fine-tuned and improved, right? I have to say that the reaction of governments from a financial standpoint of view are exemplary, right? So, but one could ask yourself, how many times can you do something like that?
Exactly.
In terms of preparedness, I have to say that probably the willingness of people to, from a private standpoint of view, to invest in an insurance scheme that pays a premium in order to get a payout one day, we don't know when, to cover for certain losses would definitely help people to be aware of what they risk if something like that happens. Now, that's theory, because we know, actually as an industry, we have been trying to promote thinking about preparing for another pandemic and try to see if there is a desire by the private sector or even by governments to engage. And the answer is that nobody has an interest really to do that. Why? Because first of all, people are not so keen to put in a premium every year to pay for something that they deem probably, I don't know if I really gonna get something. And number two, which is very dangerous, people are saying, wait a second, governments will step in again if something like that happens. Why should I buy an insurance? Why should I just go through that? And of course, politicians are not so keen to impose such an insurance because that would be totally unpopular.
They wouldn't be re-elected, and that's often a very important goal for them, no wonder. Yeah, absolutely.
So the answer to the question, no, it was not been possible to insure a pandemic risk like this one, and it's definitely not possible to insure if another one comes.
Right. In one of your reports, I think it was in Sonar or the fantastic research Swiss Re does also with publications, there is a quote, 75% of the risks worldwide are not insured. Does that sound scary for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's scary. I mean, if you think that basically you're saying that 75% of we are talking about, in numbers, we are talking about $1.4 trillion of risks that are not insured. And I'm talking about health risks, mortality, and natural catastrophes, right? Those three items, account for the big chunk of the risks. And when we talk about this gap of coverage, we are talking about that magnitude of financials impact on the system. So it's a huge number. And of course, if you think that what it means, some of the numbers, I can make you some examples that I found, in learning about the business as well. I found very interesting. If you think that, for example, in the US, 5 homeowners out of 6 have no flooding insurance in their houses. When you go to Europe, in Europe, only 4% of the 130 billion of losses for earthquakes since 1970 have been insured. And in China, a third of the health cost, 200 billions of health cost in the Chinese system, only a third is covered by insurance. So you look at protection gap in that sense.
Exactly.
When you bring it down to concrete examples of what it is,
it's pretty impressive.
It's impressive. Yeah. Now, of course, our job, together with the primary insurer, is to help reducing this coverage gap, to make it more accessible for clients to buy an insurance.
How do you do that?
Well, both ways. Of course, the most obvious way is that we deploy capital, we put capital at risk, we analyze risk, and we try to get smarter in the way we look at that. And so capital deployment is one part of the equation, but also as important for us is to help our clients, the insurer, and their clients to understand their risks and particularly mitigate or avoid certain risks. Because at the end of the day, if the amount of dollars available for buying insurance is defined, what you can work on is to try to reduce the risk so that $1 can buy more insurance. And of course, we see growth in the industry. We can cover the gap, for example, by the fact that more and more, particularly in emerging markets, people have some things to lose because they become wealthy, and therefore they need to take an insurance because they have some things to lose. Or, by the way, on the 75% not covered, you may include also pandemic. So there are risks that we will never going to be able to cover. So our job is to try to educate and become smarter in the way we manage risk and in the way we deploy our capital.
It's also a task to enlighten people about the risks they take, for instance, if they are not insured. But America is a good example. I think there's still a kind of frontier spirit there. Okay, if it happens, it's horrible, and then we build a new one. And there are other countries, the Swiss are the total opposite. They are sometimes over-insured, as one says, because they fear everything and they want to protect themselves against everything, which is also not possible. So there are also cultural differences towards the concept of insuring oneself.
Yeah, we developed a very nice study where it shows very clearly that if you go into developed countries, there is almost like an S-curve development, where in the developed countries, of course, the insurance sector is growing with GDP, and even you can go even to a situation like either people are overly insured or double insured, right? Without knowingly or not knowingly, or they are willing to take risks because they have wealth and they can take risk. And they say, well, I'm not going to insure that risk because in my point of view is remote and therefore I can afford. While in emerging markets, as I mentioned before, it's very interesting to see how people coming out of poverty and going into more wealthy positions and having, building up, their own financials, or, they buy a house, they do something, they are in need to protect their assets.
Absolutely.
And therefore, or they take a health insurance or they take a life insurance because they want to, basically make sure that whatever they did, it's there to stay for the next generations as well.
Yeah, they built it up and have to protect that effort. Absolutely. Let's change to another topic, which is very important also for you personally in your thinking, but also for Swiss Re as a company and for all of us citizens aware of our responsibilities, climate change. How do you see that? I mean, you do a lot of good things within your company to reduce some effects of the climate. But do you think is it realistic that we can achieve till 2050 or the end of the century the goals we discussed in Paris, for instance, and recently in
COP26, yeah.
Exactly. Is that realistic?
Yeah, I'm not a scientist. I'm not an expert to say it's realistic. I think we have to rely on what we see, and I think I think that consensus on that topic is pretty strong and coming from different angles. I mean, very few people are debating the fact that you need to do something about that. Now, if it's 2050 or 2045 or 55, I don't know. I think that what we know is that we need to take actions. And we can also debate for a long time what are the causes around it. But it's true that there is a huge effect of what we do, right, to our planet that can be somehow eliminated or mitigated, and helping achieving a much better position. Now, we also know, and here again you can argue if it's one number or the other, that the impact of global warming on the economies is going to be huge. If we do nothing, our Swiss Re Institute has published an estimation of an 18% GDP impact. I mean, basically opportunity cost, or less growth, or opportunity cost, or contraction of GDP between now and 2050. Now, if everything that the Paris Agreement is done, that could be limited at around 4 or 5%. So you see that any numbers in between, may be right or wrong, but there is an agreement that there is an impact. And most importantly, that goes beyond numbers. Such an event would also create huge impact on society, because lack of growth, or even for some people, losing what they have because of climate change. The climate change is not only something that affects properties and but also affects health conditions. And so there is a ramification on society that is much broader than just what we see, almost regularly nowadays in terms of climate impact because of weather conditions.
Absolutely, and you're right. On the long run, we are all in the same boat. Yeah. However, there are countries who need more energy desperately, like Africa.
Yeah,
or
and
China.
that's the biggest challenge we have, because of course I always say that it's very easy for us here to say, well, stop drilling out oil and gas. For us, we have, maybe not today, because it looks like we also have a problem with energy supply, but I would say that for certain countries is a matter of going out of poverty, having access to electricity, and to fundamental things that we take for granted. So it's very easy for us to go and tell people what to do.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge.
Exactly.
How we help them in the transition. It's very important.
Yeah.
I think that we have to realize that some pragmatic solutions on how to achieve those targets.
How active are you in this goal to help developing countries in finding a better way to use energy?
Not only the developing countries, also our clients active in developed countries. We took a view that we will implement any change in policy with a transition. So clients know what we stand for in advance, and we help them to understand what they need to do in order to be eligible for coverage over the years. And they know that at a certain point in time, certain coverage won't be there if they continue to do what they do today, or if they want to go into new drills in a place that we believe is not appropriate, right? So what we are doing is again the part of education. It's not just about saying we commit or we don't commit. We are not going to clients and tell them overnight something that they don't expect. They know what we stand for and what we believe we and they should do in order to achieve certain targets. That's the only way you can get consensus globally.
Yeah.
By being adaptive to people needs and priorities, I think is very important.
Consciousness to be aware of the problems and solid education. However, now we have huge geopolitical problems and crises, and which also cause more energy problems, of course. We see the discussions in Germany about coal and nuclear plants. So somehow we have to provide what they need,
Of course, and here, I have to say that what we are going through right now, my reaction in looking at these events, in terms of energy supply and where, what we are facing right now in Europe,
is, we have to call it for what it is mismanagement. I mean, from a risk, if you would have been a bank or an insurance company, that's really, concentration risks, lack of diversification.
Over 20 years.
Well, we made all the mistakes that they would never be allowed in our industry in terms of how we manage any risk. So the truth of the matter is that there is enough energy in the world. The reason we have a crisis in Europe is because we just basically put all the chips in the same, too many countries in the same direction, same source of energy, same supplier. And by the way, not only on a standalone basis, if you look at the other informations available from a geopolitical standpoint of view over the last 10, 15 years, you wonder why we are in this situation. Now, it is what it is. And we have to, at this stage, be flexible in the way we may have to look at how we achieve the targets, the 2050 targets, how we review what we have done in the past. And here I'm talking, clearly, stepping out of, in certain countries in Europe, from nuclear in a totally irrational and emotional way was a mistake.
Yeah.
And we have to call it for what it is. And therefore, it takes now not only an adaptation of policies in respect of looking at how we look at emerging countries, but also in our own countries on really reassessing what has been done.
I fully agree. It's also often hypocritical. The Germans take energy from the nuclear plants of France and themselves are not willing to keep them alive, or not to speak of building new ones. So this is still an ideological battle, I would say, over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and there will be a lot of problems with that.
No, when I hear that we are still producing, because of that, we are still producing now electricity with coal, then I have to say, so maybe something went really wrong here.
Absolutely. Another risk, cyber risk. I'm a little bit surprised till now that the threat of cyber risk didn't play such a role during the current war of Russia against Ukraine. Because when it started, experts said, this will end or soon get into also a very heavy war of cyber attacks. We haven't seen that yet. Nevertheless, cyber threats are enormous and could damage the world economy and whole political systems in an absolutely terrible way. So what's your position to that, and what does your company provide to insure them not only, but also help to maybe to avoid the worst?
No, maybe one point is that it is true that we haven't seen big headlines around cyber surrounding the Russian-Ukraine situation, but indeed, I know, talking to experts, that there has been huge attacks, right? Starting at least, a few months before the invasion. 1 month before the invasion, huge attacks on the energy system, on the financial networks, and only the fact that the Ukrainians were prepared through intelligence, but also through capabilities. Ukraine is a pretty advanced country in terms of technology. They've been able to push back in a pretty effective way those attacks. Also, counting on international cooperation and more a deeper dialogue between the private and the public sector. So the reason you don't see this as an issue, even post the invasion, even post February this year, is because the alert and the level of scrutiny around cyber, it's huge. And last but not least, cyber attacks that would spill outside Ukraine in terms of their scope would probably be seen against or affecting a NATO country, would probably be seen as an attack to NATO.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's also, in my point of view, there is no interest to go too far, even by the Russians, because that would really create, a potential further escalation.
Sure.
Now, what can we do? Well, of course, there is also, because of everything we say, technology, the good news, technology is connecting all of us globally and in a very effective and efficient way. Having said that, more and more networks and data are shared in the same system, and we come back into the pandemic issue. So it's when something's happened to a big provider of software or infrastructure, the likelihood that the correlation goes up to 1 in terms of impact to businesses and society makes it a very difficult risk to insure, right? So that's the limitation. So it is clear that, again here, when you measure the cost of preventing such attacks for our society to put up resilience, IT resilience, security, training, it's huge. It's probably, according to external analysis, and is around $1 trillion a year. So the vast majority is not damages, like loss of data or inability to deliver a service or claims or by third parties, or loss of intellectual properties, you name it. But that part of the cost is fairly limited, right? The big cost is to avoid being attacked, which, to be fair, you have also to take in consideration all the advantages we have because of technology. Now, the insurance market for cyber is booming, but in a sense, is only this year is going to be around 13 billion. So in terms of premiums, 13 billion. So it sounds huge, but it's not very big in the big scheme. So, but it's growing very fast. Only in the US this year we expect a 70% increase. But what's happening there is that the conditions to be eligible for a cyber coverage are increasing also very much. So if you don't demonstrate the ability to, avoid or reduce the risk around cyber attacks, you are not eligible for a coverage.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy topic to cover. We have to be very careful about how we look at it. We believe there are definitely there is a scope for the private sector to be part of the solution, but risk mitigation and risk management by the underlying clients and systems is very important.
Some other topics not directly connected to risks and risk business, but concerning all of us. Speaking of political leadership, for instance, where do you see any hope in a reality which is distinguished mostly by mediocrity?
Well, no, it's a very difficult questions, and it's clear that we would, at the end of the day, we are the one electing. We criticize politicians.
It's our guilt
Yeah,
somehow.
So to be fair, the problem starts with us. So at the end of the day, it's easy to blame politicians, but it's true that we are responsible for that. What I believe is, it's clear that the impact of globalization makes it almost also very difficult to manage a country or a system, because more and more, and I see it in Switzerland, we have a tendency to import the problems we don't have. Basically, we believe that somebody else has a problem. Oh, that problem must be also ours. So let's try to, address it in a way that is absolutely nothing to do with reality. So in a sense, I think that what we need is probably people that can be more courageous, but I know there are limitations, because we mentioned it at the very beginning. If you are too courageous, you may not maybe be reelected. If you say too much the truth, you may not go through the next round. So what I do believe is different than between politics and the private sector. Of course, in many instances, in the private sector, you can lose the job overnight. But eventually, if you don't do something really wrong, you don't go for an election every year as a CEO or of an organization or a member of an executive board. Of course, as a chairman of Swiss Re, I get through the election every year, but still. The difference is that politicians, in my point of view, are too much under pressure because of elections coming, on a fairly regular basis, either at country or national levels, regional levels, very local levels. And in many countries, you can see how this constant electoral campaigns is affecting their ability to take actions and to communicate. Also something that has an element of a sacrifice.
Exactly.
In order to create a better future. And in my point of view, I would, it's not the case in Switzerland, it's less so.
Is it?
Although I have to say that, and I know some people don't like that, but I do believe that I'm a big believer of our direct democracy, but the direct democracy in Switzerland is abused, even from political parties in the governments for, running de facto a 36 days a year political campaign and election campaign or preparation. So, but in many countries, this is really affecting their ability to make changes.
And not solving the problems they should solve.
So if I would want to see something changing, is the ability to elect any governments and people, more and more people more than parties, personally, and make them accountable and let them work and see what they deliver.
And also education to leadership. My God, I mean.
Yeah, but leadership is not something you can educate. Either you have it or you don't have it.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, so.
A good education. A good mentor, for instance.
But that's education, is not leadership. You can be very well educated and be no leader.
Of course. But
so
still,
that's the issue. So
don't destroy all my hope, but Swissness is a very nice word, a little bit blurred today by all the interdependence of states and big companies, social movements, etc., etc. What does it still mean for you? What is special about Swissness compared to the rest of the world?
Well, the Swissness is, in my point of view, when you tell me that it's an ability to combine pragmatism with an efficient system, political and administrative system, in a very diverse setup in terms of cultures. So in my point of view, the Swissness is probably the best example of how a federal model should work. Of course, the United States are very close to that. Germany is also not far away from that. And I think that Swissness, so reliability of the rules of law, the stability of the political system with all the limitations I said before is still very good, in my point of view. But the most important issue is an example on how, over the years, different cultures can work together under one umbrella without losing their identity.
Until now, it worked pretty well.
And I am a firm believer that I know is fantasy, but the solution of Europe to come out of its problem would be an adapted version
of Switzerland. Yeah.
to realize that certain things should be centralized, but Europe, the culture of Europe, needs to be somehow reflected at the local levels and therefore at the central levels, sorry. And therefore, the federal system would be a better solution. The Swiss system, the Swissness, a little bit of Swissness into Europe would help.
That's a good thing to promote. Let's start tonight.
Yes.
My last question then is open for this discussion among us. Fit for the future means also fit for competence. What is the message we should give the younger generations to become successful citizens of the world? What's your advice?
Well, my advice is of course, the new generations are facing a very, still some challenging times because, some of the issues we discussed today, we haven't really touched we touched on climate, we touched on risk, but, we haven't touched on, for example, the burden of debt that we are leaving behind, coming out of this last 10, 20 years. But the young generation have a bright future. First of all, I believe that, in history, our parents, the previous generation have been going through, wars that were even, pretty tough, very brutal, and still they've been able to come back and show that there is a future. So I'm a firm believer that the future looks good. And new generations have an ability now to start with a knowledge base that is much higher than the one we had. So it's always good, it's always great. The education system is more flexible and sophisticated, and this is allowing people to grow and develop into different ways. And the most interesting part for young people is the fact that, well, good news, bad news. Many of the jobs or many of the things they are studying today won't be relevant in 20, 30 years.
That's very good.
But the great news is that the flexibility they have,
Right.
they should enjoy it. And my advice is always the same. When I tell people, put passion in what you do, be flexible in what you should do and what you are asked to do. And most importantly, don't rely on your employer or on governments for your post-formal education. Stay up to speed, stay competitive as an individual in the labor market. Don't let anybody else control that part of the equation.
It's also your own responsibility.
Absolutely.
We have a question here on the screen. How likely is it that the reinsurance model becomes obsolete at some point if the insurance sector knows enough to mitigate risk?
Well, I guess some people in the room here have heard that question many years before me, it's almost like when I hear people saying, "Well, banks won't exist any longer," and that's okay, fine. Now, why I think reinsurance will continue to exist, maybe in a different shape or form, because also reinsurance are reinventing themselves, is because at the end of the day, the system, and you see it this year, the system still needs to see somebody stepping in to absorb shocks. Probably many of the people that would think that, in the future a reinsurer is not necessary are probably thinking that alternative capital can step in. Of course it's true, and of course we are also involved in that. But alternative capital is very unreliable. So it is clear to me that very few primary insurers have diversification. They may have knowledge, but very few have global diversification or line of businesses diversification. And they rely on reinsurer that benefits from diversification to offload risks and create capacity to serve their clients.
Right.
So as long as we are able to demonstrate our ability to our shareholders that we can deploy their capital in a sustainable way, giving sustainable returns, I have little doubt that the industry, the primary insurer, will look at us for knowledge or capital. But if you are not able, as an industry, as a reinsurance industry, to provide appropriate returns, that's more likely to be the triggering point for the question marks.
Okay. But the reliability of the institution is also a very strong value.
The value, again, people, I mean, at the end of the day, what we are doing to the system, we take the volatility that the system don't want to have, right? So, I mean, if you look at the swings in the profit and loss statement of a reinsurer, it's very volatile. So that's not something that many other stakeholders like to see. So there is a role for us.
Questions here in the auditorium, please.
You mentioned at the beginning tough aspect.
I think we have a microphone.
You mentioned at the beginning the tough aspect are risks which we don't know. Is there a structured approach how we can anticipate them anyway? I mean, I give a practical example to help. It may sound a bit crazy, but there are people looking at eruptions of the sun, which someday may have an impact on us.
Yeah, well, that one probably we don't need to insure because that means we are not around any longer, right? So I guess that what we try to do more and more is to put, first of all, I think that trying always to measure, in my point of view, what are the risks that we have been observing, and what does it mean if they play out to other sectors or other countries or other situations. That's one element. And more creating an environment in which you come out with something that may seem as fantasy, totally not plausible, and understand what are the impacts. But in my point of view, as I said before, I can't really, if I would know the answer to your question, it would not be any longer such a big problem for me, right? So because I'm always thinking about the one thing that I don't know. And if I know about that one, I can at least assess, right? So I would only say that when you hear any hypothesis of a risk, always try to have somebody or yourself look at it and never playing it down as a total nonsense. I don't see any upside of playing down any idea that comes in terms of risk factors.
Further questions? Please.
So thank you very much. I realize with pleasure how much biodiversity terminology sneaks in your own expressions. I realized productivity diversity theory or the diversity reinsurance theory. So I had a question related to a remark that at the beginning it was said 75% of the risk may not be insured at the moment. But at the same time you say we do not insure or reinsure risks if they are not sufficiently diversified. So can it be that the 75% is actually something that we were completely missing out to diversify? Which means if it's not insurable and not reinsurable, the 75%, it may not be a problem of available capital or financial strength, but actually risks that we generated and they're not sufficiently diversified. So it could be a measure of non-diversification, the 75%. I would be interested to hear your opinion about that.
No, maybe I wasn't clear, but 75% of the risk, part of it is not insurable. For example, pandemic. Pandemic is not insurable. The internet breaking down globally is not something that you can insure, right? So that's part of the 75. The other 75 is basically people not having the financial means to be able to buy an insurance, or simply people that underestimate the risks. And they are, like for example in the US, when I say that 5 house owners out of 6 are not insured against flooding, it's not because there is no insurance or capacity for flooding in the US. It's because they deem that risk acceptable, or they think if something's happened, the governments will pay, or I want to spend the money for something else. I don't know. But that's the coverage gap. In theory, they should be insured. In practice, they are not willing to be insured. So I hope I explained. So you can't really mix the two. And of course, the risks that are basically systemic, globally systemically, are not insured because, de facto, if the premium would be so high to insure it that it would not make sense to insure it.
Next question, please. Michael Hengartner.
Thank you, Sergio. I would have a question about the future. You clearly stated that you are basically positive for the future. Is that also true for the short term, or do you think we have to go sort of a deep recession within the next 1 or 2 years? Or are you rather positive for the long term, or also for the short and mid term?
Look, I think that, I hope we won't see a deep recession, but it's, the fact that we will see a recession is almost inevitable. Now, again, I'm not masochist. I'm not looking forward for a recession, but I do think that a recession may help the system, the economic, political system, to think about resetting. It's an opportunity to reset. There are elements of the growth we saw in the last few years that we know is not sustainable. There have been changes in society, in technology, that are highly impacting the way we will operate in the future. Therefore, a recession will also probably help resetting the situation. So, in a sense, many of the issues that we face today, in my point of view, are the fact that governments and central banks have been trying to avoid at any cost a recession. And a recession belongs to this economic cycle. It's part of the natural evolution. Recessions are there also to help reset a new base for the next phase of growth. So, again, not looking for a recession per se, but I do think that maybe there is some positive aspects of having a little recession.
Final question, Michael Hengartner, please.
Sergio, I think one of the risks that most of our institutions share is the risk of not finding sufficient young talent to replace the people who go into retirement. It's not something we can insure against, but it's something we can mitigate. I'd be interested in hearing what Swiss Re is doing to make sure that the brightest young kids, girls and boys, decide to work for Swiss Re once they graduate.
Well, we do a lot. I mean, the issue is clear that it's the obvious. We invest in not only in the young, very bright people, but most importantly, how do you keep your existing population well educated, up to speed? I go back to my comments before, competitive in the market, because it's not just about the young generations. For example, of course, for us, it's very easy to attract good talents in Switzerland, but we have to look at, we have 3/4 of our people outside Switzerland. So we need to look at way to attract and to get them to know about Swiss Re, about our industry, and so on and so forth. But the most important issue is how to educate and retain talents, because the vast majority, we spend a lot of time replacing people that go to a competitor or to somewhere else, or even people that want to change their balance of life, between profession and professional and personal aspirations. So how can we retain some of those talents when they want to work less? It's very important that we create flexible environment in which education and flexible systems are allowing us to keep the best talents.
Thank you very much, Sergio Ermotti. I think that was a great discussion, conversation. I hope, gentlemen, you enjoyed it too, ladies and gentlemen on the screen. Thanks again, and thanks also to Swiss Re for having the opportunity to be here. It's a wonderful place for thinking and for enjoying. Thank you.
Thank you.